Okay, so I am doing a presentation about the question, what effects do virginity pledges have on teenage sexual behavior? Okay, so we're going to start with the fact that this is a really difficult research question because not only are we talking about sexual behavior, something that is difficult to talk about for a lot of people, but we're also talking about teenagers who lie through their teeth for the fun of it, not to mention that they have to think about all kinds of social backlash for every little thing that they do. So much to say that gathering data for this research question will be difficult. Do we need to differentiate between different types of virginity pledges? That's a really big question. Virginity pledges could come from a religious standpoint, or they could come from like an abstinence-only school program. It's important to differentiate between males and females as well, because although we don't want to assume attitudes towards sex are different between males and females, we should probably be on the lookout for differences. Also, what do we consider sexual behavior? And do virginity pledges perhaps encourage other types of sexual behavior? Besides sex, I mean. And is the idea behind virginity pledges reducing teenage pregnancy and STDs? Or is it discouraging premarital sex, like from a religious standpoint? Or are we simply encouraging morality and good decision making? So all of these questions we should keep in mind in designing our research. So let's talk about different methods. We have surveys, available data, field methods, and experiments, not necessarily in that order. We're going to go through and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each type. So we're going to start with experiment. So I think setting up an experiment for gauging teenage promiscuity or teenage sexual behavior in regards to virginity pledges would be really difficult, not to mention possibly unethical. So on the one hand, we can control situations, but when we're trying to gauge decision making, can we get real results from that kind of experiment? For example, we could have a group of subjects, boys and girls, all teenagers, divided into two groups. So one takes the virginity pledge, the experimental group, which would be the treatment, and one does not, the control group. Then we put them in situations where sexual behavior might occur, like broom closets, under the bleachers, a summer cabin, and see what ensues. This doesn't seem like a very good idea. So I would have to say that an experiment for this question has some serious weaknesses, simply because it would be very difficult to set up an experiment that will both be ethical and yield meaningful results. You have probably a lot of reactivity in an experiment like this. And it would also be really difficult to choose subjects that represent the vast number of teenagers in the world, so generalizing the results would be really tricky. Okay, so another available research method is using available data to help us find the connection between virginity pledges and teenage sexual behavior. This method is non-reactive. However, I think data would be extremely difficult to come by. It might be possible to find records of virginity pledges signed, such as in a Cheer Truth group notes or something like that, but there's little chance that you'll find records of each teenager's sexual activity. It might also be possible to compare the names of any virginity records to mothers in local hospitals or STD clinics, but not only is that information possibly classified because we're talking about minors, but it would be really difficult to find either one or two names in these records. And it would be difficult to determine whether signing the virginity pledge actually had anything to do with the situation. Also, with birth records, we're only talking about girls, and that's a little skewed. So we also have to consider virginity pledge records to begin with. Who and why would anyone keep records of this kind of thing, besides like accidentally? I personally find that a little creepy. So overall, I do not think that available data would be very helpful in determining a connection between virginity pledges and teenage sexual behavior, just because the right kind of data isn't really available. So a third method used by a lot of sociologists is field methods. There are a variety of different types of field methods. For example, would a researcher want to be a participant, meaning trying to integrate into a teenage society to get results? Or would a researcher just want to sit back and watch, non-participant research? Would the researcher want teens to know they were being studied? Well, since we're talking about teenagers and sex, we have to consider the creepiness factor. So even though when people know they're being studied, they sometimes act differently, known as reactivity or the Hawthorne effect, an adult asking teens about their sex lives for no apparent reason doesn't come off so well. So how does an adult really integrate themselves into a teen society? I mean, 21 Jump Street kind of comes to mind, but that takes cooperation from the school, parental knowledge, and a lot of complication. It would also take a long time to integrate, because teenagers are notoriously dodgy, And if you did manage to actually collect results, you could probably get deeper information, but would it be generalizable? So overall, considering the subjects and subject matter, this method does not seem very feasible for this particular situation and for this particular research method. So lastly, we have surveys. This method seems to me like the most effective one for this question, as we have discussed the sensitivity and ethics surrounding teenagers and sex. Surveys are not covert, and subjects can choose whether or not they want to participate. They are also relatively low cost, and depending on the method, it is possible to get a very large amount of data from a wide range of subjects in a relatively short amount of time. You can also get really specific yet deep information by using a variety of open and closed-ended questions. There is a risk of reactivity and dishonesty, especially considering the rather taboo nature of the questions we would be asking. Our teenage subjects might feel pressure to answer questions in a certain way, and some questions might not be clear to everyone. It would be the job of the survey writer and the interviewer to make a safe environment and provide clear questions. So, going further, for my hypothetical research project, I would design two sets of questions. One would be mostly closed-ended questions to make up a written pen and paper survey, and one would be more open-ended for face-to-face interviews. It would be important to make sure that all of my subjects are teenagers, so online surveys and phone interviews would not be preferable because the answers of different aged people might skew results. So I think the best place to conduct surveys would be at schools, just because you have a lot of teenagers there of different ages, different backgrounds, and it would probably require the permission of school officials. However, many schools are often willing to participate in research, as long as it isn't too disruptive to classrooms. So research could probably go from class to class administering the anonymous, confidential paper surveys, 5 to 10 minutes, maybe. It would probably be best if subjects do not know the exact connection that we're trying to make, because it might skew results. So the paper surveys would be anonymous, again, and they would be confidential, and they probably include questions like gender, age, have you ever made a virginity pledge? If so, where? Are you currently sexually active? If so, how often? If not, why? These questions are a little rough and need some fine-tuning, but this is probably the kind of information that would be helpful in establishing at least the beginnings of a connection between virginity pledges and sexual behavior in teenagers. After a large number of paper surveys have been collected and analyzed, researchers would then get the permission of the school to conduct one-on-one interviews with random students. And this part might be tricky because many teachers might feel uncomfortable talking to an adult about their sexual behavior, but the researcher could really try to create a safe environment, or else maybe have a school counselor present. Of course, students are welcome to refuse to answer any questions, as refusing to answer is kind of its own kind of result. And the questions would be similar to the paper surveys, but include why as a factor, in order to get a deeper understanding for the motivations of teenagers, both to take virginity pledges and engage in sexual behavior. So the data collected from these interviews would be used to interpret the paper surveys, and any common answers might be considered for further research. So overall, these surveys would probably not be a piece of cake, but I think they would provide more meaningful results than experiments, more broad results than existing data, more time efficient and probably ethical results than field study, and overall it would probably be more generalizable than any of the other methods. So if any of the questions or aspects of the process need to be tweaked, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, and this adds a level of flexibility to the overall method. Thanks!